The jungle fell silent at 2:17 a.m. on March 15, 1968. Staff Sergeant Dennis Brown of the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion crouched behind a cluster of bamboo 30 meters from the Viet Cong tunnel complex, his portable loudspeaker system humming with electric anticipation. For 3 weeks, his unit had been perfecting what the Pentagon brass called their most ambitious psychological warfare operation yet. Tonight, they would unleash hell itself upon the enemy. Tonight, they would broadcast the voices of the dead. Brown pressed play on the reel-to-reel tape labeled Ghost Tape Number 10. And immediately, the Vietnamese jungle transformed into something from humanity's darkest nightmares. A low, mournful Buddhist funeral dirge began seeping through the humid air, followed by the agonized wails of tortured souls crying out in perfect Vietnamese. "Daddy, come home to us." A child's voice pleaded through the static, while the echo-chambered voice of a dead North Vietnamese soldier shrieked from beyond the grave. It was a senseless death. How senseless, how senseless. But when I realized the truth, it was too late. What Brown couldn't have known as he watched the enemy positions through his night vision scope was that Operation Wandering Soul would succeed far beyond the military's wildest expectations. And that success would come with a price no one had calculated. The genesis of this psychological warfare masterpiece began 6 months earlier in a cramped recording studio in downtown Saigon, where U.S. Army engineers worked alongside South Vietnamese linguists and defected Viet Cong soldiers to create what they believed would be the ultimate weapon of terror. The Americans had discovered something profound about their enemy. Unlike Western soldiers who feared death itself, Vietnamese fighters feared something far worse: the eternal wandering of an unburied soul. In Vietnamese Buddhist tradition, a person who dies away from their ancestral burial ground is condemned to wander as a restless ghost, forever calling out to their loved ones, forever denied the peace of the afterlife. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Hackworth, the legendary commander who helped conceptualize the operation, understood that conventional warfare wasn't winning this conflict. The Viet Cong were ghosts themselves, appearing and disappearing into tunnel networks that honeycombed the jungle floor. If you couldn't see your enemy, if you couldn't engage them in traditional combat, then you had to attack their minds. You had to make them afraid of the dark. For weeks, the recording sessions in Saigon continued with methodical precision. Sound engineers experimented with echo chambers, reverb effects, and multi-layered audio tracks to create the most bone-chilling supernatural experience possible. They recorded the voices of grieving mothers calling their sons home, the cries of children pleading for their fathers, and most disturbingly, the anguished confessions of dead soldiers warning their comrades about the futility of their cause. Every scream, every whisper, every supernatural moan was crafted to exploit the deepest psychological vulnerabilities of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The final product was a 14-minute audio nightmare that sounded like it had been recorded in the depths of hell itself. Vietnamese-speaking actors, including defected enemy soldiers who knew exactly how to make their former comrades' blood run cold, delivered performances that even the American engineers found deeply unsettling. One sound technician later admitted he couldn't sleep for days after completing the recordings, and several South Vietnamese personnel requested transfers rather than continue working on the project. But the true test would come in the field, where 6th PSYOP battalion soldiers like Dennis Brown would carry these portable loudspeaker systems through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. The plan was elegantly simple. Teams would position themselves near suspected Viet Cong positions under cover of darkness and broadcast Ghost Tape Number 10 for hours at a time. The psychological impact, military planners believed, would be devastating. Enemy soldiers would become convinced that the jungle itself was haunted by the angry spirits of their fallen comrades, urging them to abandon their posts and return home before suffering the same terrible fate. The operation's first deployment in February 1968 exceeded all expectations. Within hours of the initial broadcast near a major Viet Cong stronghold in Binh Dinh province, intelligence reports began flooding in about enemy soldiers abandoning their positions in apparent terror. Local South Vietnamese forces reported finding freshly dug foxholes and supply caches completely deserted, with personal belongings scattered as if their owners had fled in panic. Some enemy fighters were captured wandering aimlessly through the jungle, claiming they could no longer distinguish between the voices of the living and the dead. The success was so dramatic that the 6th PSYOP Battalion received immediate orders to expand the operation. Teams deployed across South Vietnam, carrying their ghostly cargo into the most contested regions of the war. From the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone, the voices of the dead began haunting the Vietnamese countryside night after night. Intelligence analysts documented a measurable increase in enemy defections, with captured Viet Cong soldiers frequently mentioning the angry spirits that had driven them from their hiding places. But as the operation expanded, something unprecedented began to happen. American soldiers stationed outside the broadcast range started reporting auditory phenomena that couldn't be explained by any tactical manual. Forward observation posts miles from the nearest PSYOP team began logging reports of Vietnamese voices calling out in the darkness, voices that seemed to come from empty jungle. Patrol leaders found themselves checking and rechecking their radios, convinced they were receiving transmissions in Vietnamese, only to find their communication equipment completely silent. The reports initially came from isolated units, scattered across different provinces with no apparent connection to each other. A reconnaissance team near Da Nang reported hearing children's voices calling in Vietnamese just before dawn, despite being positioned in an area that intelligence had classified as completely uninhabited. A Marine patrol in Quang Tri province radioed their base to report voices warning them in broken English about death in the morning, only to discover later that no friendly forces were operating within 20 miles of their position. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell of the 101st Airborne Division filed what would become one of the most disturbing incident reports of the entire Vietnam War. His unit had been conducting night reconnaissance near a suspected enemy supply route when they began hearing what he described as conversations in Vietnamese coming from directly above us, like there were people talking in the trees. When Mitchell's team investigated with flashlights, they found nothing but empty canopy. The voices continued for 3 hours, growing louder and more agitated, until Mitchell made the unprecedented decision to abort the mission and return to base. The psychological impact on American forces was swift and severe. Units that had never been exposed to Operation Wandering Soul began requesting transfers away from areas where the voices had been reported. Soldiers who had served multiple tours without incident suddenly found themselves unable to sleep, convinced they could hear Vietnamese whispers in the wind. Medical personnel documented a spike in combat stress reactions among troops who hadn't seen actual combat in weeks. The situation reached a crisis point on March 23, 1968, when an entire platoon of the 25th Infantry Division refused to conduct night patrols for 3 consecutive days. The unit's commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, filed an emergency report stating that his men had become convinced they were being stalked by enemy ghosts after repeatedly hearing Vietnamese voices that seemed to emanate from nowhere. What made the report particularly troubling was that Hayes' unit was stationed over 40 miles from the nearest confirmed PSYOP broadcast operation. Military psychiatrists were quickly deployed to assess the situation, but their findings only deepened the mystery. Soldiers were reporting remarkably consistent auditory experiences despite being separated by hundreds of miles and having no contact with each other. The voices they described followed identical patterns. Vietnamese speakers, usually male, delivering warnings or threats, often followed by the sound of children crying or calling for their parents. Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychologist brought in to evaluate affected personnel, documented case after case of soldiers reporting what she termed contagious auditory hallucinations. In her classified report, She noted that the phenomenon seemed to spread through units like a psychological infection, with soldiers who had initially reported no unusual experiences suddenly beginning to hear the voices after speaking with affected comrades. The military's response was swift and decisive. Operation Wandering Soul was immediately classified at the highest levels, with all personnel involved sworn to secrecy. The ghost tapes were quietly withdrawn from field operations, and the 6th PSYOP Battalion was reassigned to less controversial propaganda missions. Official records would later claim the operation had been terminated due to limited tactical effectiveness. But internal memos painted a very different picture. Colonel William Porter, the commanding officer who ultimately made the decision to end Operation Wandering Soul, wrote in his private correspondence, "We created something we couldn't control. The tapes were meant to frighten the enemy, but they ended up terrifying our own forces. I've been in this war for 3 years, and I've never seen anything affect morale like those voices did. We were fighting an enemy we couldn't see, and suddenly our own soldiers were hearing enemies that weren't there at all." The aftermath of Operation Wandering Soul would haunt the U.S. military for decades. Veterans continued reporting auditory experiences long after returning home, with many describing Vietnamese voices that seemed to follow them across oceans and through time. Support groups for Vietnam veterans documented hundreds of cases of former servicemen who claimed they could still hear the ghost voices from the jungle, warning them, pleading with them, calling them back to a war that had officially ended years earlier. The tapes themselves disappeared into the classified archives of the Pentagon, but bootleg copies began circulating among military personnel and eventually leaked to the public. Decades later, researchers studying the psychological impact of warfare would point to Operation Wandering Soul as a watershed moment in understanding how psychological operations could backfire spectacularly, affecting not just the intended targets, but the operators themselves. What the military planners had failed to anticipate was the fundamental power of sound itself. In the claustrophobic environment of jungle warfare, where visibility was limited and every shadow could conceal death, auditory experiences took on profound psychological significance. When soldiers already operating under extreme stress were exposed to the idea that Vietnamese voices in the darkness might be supernatural in origin, their minds began interpreting every unexplained sound through that terrifying lens. The phenomenon revealed something profound about human psychology under extreme conditions. Fear, it turned out, was just as contagious as any biological pathogen. When soldiers heard their comrades reporting ghostly voices, their own hypervigilant nervous systems began filtering ambient jungle sounds through the expectation of supernatural encounters. The rustling of leaves became whispered warnings. The calls of nocturnal birds transformed into children's voices, and the wind through the trees carried the conversations of the dead. Dr. Chen's final report on Operation Wandering Soul concluded that the U.S. military had inadvertently conducted one of the largest psychological experiments in history, demonstrating how artificial terror could take on a life of its own. The ghost voices had become real, not because they were supernatural, but because belief in their existence had spread through American forces like wildfire, creating a shared psychological reality that was more powerful than any tape recording. The legacy of Operation Wandering Soul extends far beyond the Vietnam War. Military psychologists now study the operation as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of psychological warfare. The incident has been cited in countless academic papers on group psychology, mass hysteria, and the power of suggestion in high-stress environments. It stands as perhaps the only documented case in military history where a psychological operation designed to terrorize the enemy ended up psychologically damaging the forces that deployed it. Today, the ghost tapes remain classified, locked away in secure facilities where they continue to hold their dark secrets. The soldiers who heard the voices, both real and imagined, have mostly taken their experiences to their graves. But the story of Operation Wandering Soul endures as a stark reminder that in the fog of war, the line between reality and nightmare can disappear entirely, leaving behind only the echoes of voices that may never truly be silenced. In the end, the US military had set out to weaponize fear itself, to turn the enemy's deepest cultural beliefs against them in service of victory. What they discovered instead was that terror, once unleashed, recognizes no boundaries between friend and foe. The ghosts they created in those Saigon recording studios didn't just haunt the Viet Cong, they haunted everyone who encountered them, proving that some weapons are too dangerous even for those who wield them. The jungle that once echoed with the artificial screams of the dead has long since grown quiet, but the lessons of Operation Wandering Soul continue to resonate through military doctrine and psychological research. It remains one of the most chilling examples of how the human mind, under extreme stress, can transform manufactured horror into lived reality, creating ghosts that exist not in the supernatural realm, but in the far more terrifying landscape of human consciousness itself.